Have you ever had someone try to dictate your life based on rules they seemingly pulled out of thin air, wrapped in an impenetrable cloak of self-importance? I am talking about the kind of person who wields their minuscule perceived authority like a weapon of mass disruption, convinced they are the sole arbiter of what is right and proper in their tiny corner of the world. Well, I have, and this particular individual, let us call her Carol Peterson, though Homeowner Association Karen became her unofficial title in my mind, picked the wrong quiet cabin owner to harass. My name is Arthur Ainsworth, and while I generally prefer a life of peaceful seclusion, my day job as a forensic accountant has equipped me with a rather particular set of skills, a meticulous attention to detail, an enjoyment of deep-dive research, and an almost unsettling patience for untangling complex webs of nonsense. I bought the cabin, and subsequently the entire surrounding valley, precisely to escape petty tyrannies and the relentless hum of other people's demands. It was meant to be my sanctuary, a place where the only rules were those dictated by nature and common sense. Carol, however, had other plans for my little piece of heaven. The first sign of trouble was the sight of flashing blue and red lights reflecting off the tranquil lake by my cabin. Two sheriff's deputies, looking rather apologetic, explained they had received a complaint about an unauthorized structure and suspicious activity. The complaint, they revealed after some gentle probing, came from a Mrs. Peterson, head of the Lakeview Estates Homeowner Association. What they did not know, and what Carol certainly could not have fathomed, was that Lakeview Estates Homeowner Association had absolutely no jurisdiction over my property, primarily because my property was Lakeview Valley in its entirety. The estates were a handful of houses on the valley's periphery, clinging to the edges of my domain like barnacles on a whale. This little detail was something I had kept to myself, preferring quiet enjoyment over grand pronouncements of ownership. But Carol, in her infinite wisdom, was about to force my hand. Her crusade against my peaceful cabin was the spark that would ignite a very slow, very methodical, and ultimately very public dismantling of her self-constructed empire. Have you ever dealt with someone who lives for the drama of imagined slights, whose entire identity seems to be built on enforcing rules that benefit no one but their own ego? It is a special kind of frustration, is it not? Stick around, because this story is not just about a cabin and a power-tripping homeowner association president. It is about the delicious, systematic unraveling of arrogance when it crashes headfirst into carefully concealed facts. The satisfaction, I promise you, will be immense. Carol Peterson was about to learn that some sleeping dogs are best left to lie, especially when those dogs own the entire kennel, the land it is on, and the road leading to it. The initial visit from the deputies was polite, almost perfunctory. I showed them my property deeds, the survey maps clearly outlining the vast acreage I owned, which encompassed the cabin, the lake, and a significant buffer of woodland around it. They noted that the address Carol Peterson had given for the violation was indeed squarely within my land, far from any conceivable boundary of her supposed homeowner association. They apologized for the intrusion, made a note in their log, and left, likely shaking their heads at another neighborhood squabble. I had hoped that would be the end of it, a minor blip, a misunderstanding smoothed over by facts. I even considered a polite, preemptive chat with Mrs. Peterson to clarify the boundaries, but something told me a reasonable conversation was not high on her agenda. My intuition, unfortunately, proved to be spot on. Instead of backing down, Carol escalated. A few days later, a letter arrived, festooned with a rather amateurishly designed Lakeview Estates Homeowner Association logo. It was a formal-looking notice of violation, citing things like unapproved exterior siding material. It was reclaimed barnwood, perfectly in keeping with a rustic cabin, non-compliant landscaping. I had let the wildflowers grow as nature intended, and failure to submit architectural plans for review. The letter demanded immediate rectification and threatened fines. It was, to put it mildly, utterly baseless. I attempted what I thought was the path of least resistance, a calm, factual phone call. Mrs. Peterson, I began, Arthur Ainsworth here. I believe there has been a misunderstanding regarding your homeowner association's jurisdiction. My cabin property is not actually part of Lakeview Estates. Her response was a masterpiece of condescending dismissal. Mr. Ainsworth, she chirped, her voice dripping with false sweetness, All properties bordering the lake fall under the purview of the Lakeview Estates covenants. It is for the good of the community to maintain standards. Perhaps you are new to the area and unfamiliar with how these things work. I tried to explain that I owned the lake and the land around it, but she cut me off, stating the homeowner association bylaws were clear and had been in place for years. She suggested I attend the next homeowner association meeting to educate myself. It was clear that reason was a foreign language to her, so my forensic accountant brain kicked into gear. If Carol Peterson wanted to play by the rules, I would learn every single rule, every bylaw, every county ordinance, and every historical precedent that might apply. I started by pulling the plat maps for the entire county, cross-referencing them with my own extensive deeds and land surveys. I then began researching the Lakeview Estates Homeowner Association itself, its articles of incorporation, its listed officers, its registered address, and any publicly available meeting minutes or financial disclosures. What I was looking for was the bedrock of her authority, the legal foundation upon which she built her little kingdom. The more I dug, the more a curious picture began to emerge, a picture that smelled less of established community governance and more of something else entirely. My investigation into the Lakeview Estates Homeowner Association started with the county registrar and the Secretary of State's database for corporations. Every legitimate homeowner association is typically a non-profit corporation with registered articles, bylaws, and a list of officers. What I found, or rather what I did not find, was the first major crack in Carol Peterson's facade. There was indeed a Lakeview Estates Development Corporation registered some 40 years prior, associated with the initial carving out of the few lots on the valley's northern rim, the ones now occupied by Carol and a handful of other homeowners. However, its status was listed as dissolved 25 years ago due to inactivity and failure to file requisite paperwork or fees. There was no active, legally recognized Lakeview Estates Homeowner Association entity. This was interesting, very interesting. So what was this homeowner association that Carol was so zealously presiding over? Was it an informal neighborhood group that had taken on airs, or was it something more deliberately deceptive? I then cross-referenced the names of the original officers of the defunct corporation with current property records. Most were long gone, deceased, or had sold their properties decades ago. Carol Peterson's name appeared nowhere on any of the old incorporation documents. She had purchased her home only 7 years prior. My next step was to delve into the county's land records with even greater scrutiny. I traced the chain of title for my vast parcel of land and for the individual lots that comprised the Lakeview Estates. The original deeds for those peripheral lots did contain some restrictive covenants, fairly standard for the era. Things like minimum house size and prohibitions against commercial activity. Crucially, however, these covenants made no mention of an active, fee-collecting, rule-enforcing homeowner association that extended beyond their platted subdivision, and certainly no mention of any authority over the massive, unsubdivided tract of land that constituted the rest of the valley, which I now owned. The aha moment arrived when I found a collection of old, unrecorded meeting notes from the original short-lived neighborhood association, tucked away in a digital archive of local historical society documents. These notes from nearly 30 years ago detailed heated discussions about the association's inability to collect dues, enforce anything, and its eventual unceremonious fizzling out. There was one particularly telling entry. Members agreed to abandon formal association due to lack of interest and legal standing for enforcement beyond original plat restrictions. So Carol Peterson was, in essence, the self-appointed queen of a phantom kingdom. She had likely stumbled upon the old covenants attached to her own deed, perhaps seen the defunct corporation name, and decided to resurrect it in her own image, either through ignorance or, more alarmingly, through deliberate misrepresentation. The fines she was threatening, the architectural reviews she demanded, they were built on sand, on a foundation of pure, unadulterated bluff. And it seemed she was the primary, if not sole, enforcer and beneficiary of this charade. This discovery shifted my frustration into a cold, calculated focus. The game had changed. This was not just about a cabin anymore, it was about exposing a carefully constructed fiction, with the irrefutable knowledge that Carol Peterson's homeowner association was at best a ghost, and at worst a fabrication she was actively perpetuating for her own sense of power, or perhaps even financial gain if she was indeed collecting dues. My strategy began to crystallize. I decided against immediate allies. While a friendly chat with a county commissioner or a stern letter from a lawyer could have been effective, there was a certain elegance, a certain forensic satisfaction, in dismantling her charade using only the truth and her own overconfidence as the tools. My plan would be multi-layered, designed not just to stop her harassment, but to publicly and unequivocally expose the hollowness of her authority. The first part of my plan was to gather more direct evidence of her misrepresentations. I had her threatening letters, but I wanted to document her claims more broadly. I knew from the tone of her phone call and the invitation to attend the next homeowner association meeting that she likely presented herself as a figure of significant local power to others. The homeowner association meeting she mentioned was the key. It was an opportunity she had created, a stage she intended to use to assert her dominance. I would let her set the stage and then I would rewrite the play. I began to prepare a comprehensive dossier, certified copies of my deeds and survey maps for the entire valley, the dissolution certificate for the original Lakeview Estates Development Corporation, printouts from the Secretary of State's website showing no active homeowner association, copies of the original plat covenants clearly showing their limited scope, and the Historical Society notes about the association's demise. I even included a neatly tabulated summary of the potential legal implications of impersonating an official organization and attempting to extort fines under false pretenses. My forensic accounting skills came in handy here, presenting complex information in a clear, undeniable, and rather intimidating format. I also decided to do a little quiet, discreet observation. Over the next week, I made a few casual drives past the small cluster of homes that constituted the Lakeview Estates. I saw Carol Peterson bustling about, occasionally stopping to chat with neighbors, exuding an air of matronly authority. I saw freshly printed Lakeview Estates Homeowner Association community rules signs posted near the entrance to their little cul-de-sac, signs that had definitely not been there a month prior. They listed things like no parking on street overnight, and all pets must be leashed, fairly standard, but the implication was that her homeowner association was enforcing them. The gall was impressive. My plan was not just about proving her wrong, it was about allowing her to climb so high on her ladder of self-importance that the fall would be truly spectacular. The upcoming homeowner association meeting, which she had so confidently invited me to, would be the perfect venue. She expected a chastened cabin owner, perhaps ready to beg for forgiveness or argue fruitlessly. She would get something else entirely. While I meticulously assembled my arsenal of facts and legal documents, Carol Peterson, blissfully unaware of the abyss she was teetering over, grew bolder. Her initial letter had been followed by a second notice of violation, final warning, this one arriving via certified mail, demanding payment of a $250 noncompliance fine within 10 days to avoid further legal action, including the placement of a lien on your property. The sheer audacity was breathtaking, a lien on property she had no claim over, from an entity that did not legally exist. It was almost comical, if not for the undercurrent of malicious intent. She was clearly accustomed to people either being intimidated or simply too bewildered to challenge her. My lack of an immediate, panicked response seemed to fuel her overconfidence. I heard through the local grapevine, a friendly chat with the owner of the general store in the nearby village where I occasionally bought supplies, that Mrs. Peterson had been rather vocal about the new cabin owner who thought he was above the rules. She had apparently lamented the decline of respect for community standards, and positioned herself as the valiant defender of Lakeview Estates' imaginary integrity. She was, in her own narrative, the hero of this story. This was perfect. Her public pronouncements, her escalating threats, they were all threads she was handing me to weave into the tapestry of her undoing. I continued to refine my plan for the homeowner association meeting. I imagined the scene, Carol presiding with smug satisfaction, perhaps with a few of her more easily influenced neighbors in attendance, ready to witness the taming of the errant cabin owner. My role would be that of the quiet observer, until the opportune moment. I was not going to engage in a shouting match or a debate over her fictitious bylaws. Instead, I would present my case with the calm, irrefutable logic of a seasoned auditor, laying out the findings of a particularly damning investigation. The beauty of the situation was that Carol was creating the very platform for her own exposure. She had called the meeting, she had invited me, she was in effect handing me the microphone and the spotlight. My only task was to ensure that when the curtain rose, the performance was not the one she had envisioned. I even prepared a few large format printouts of the key documents, the valley map showing my ownership, the homeowner association dissolution certificate, for visual impact. Sometimes a picture truly is worth 1,000 words, especially when those words are dismantling someone's carefully constructed fantasy world. Her overconfidence was my greatest ally. Each new threatening letter, each self-important pronouncement, was simply another nail she was hammering into her own coffin. And I, the quiet man in the cabin, was patiently waiting to hand her the final one. The first active step in my plan was deceptively mild. A week before the homeowner association meeting Carol had mentioned, I sent a letter. It was not addressed to Carol Peterson personally, but to the acting representative, Lakeview Estates Homeowner Association, at her address. The letter was printed on plain, high-quality paper, with no return address, identifying me by name only, by a post office box I had set up for this purpose. It was brief and to the point. To whom it may concern. It has come to our attention that certain claims of authority and attempts to levy fines are being made by an entity styling itself as the Lakeview Estates Homeowner Association, in relation to properties over which it demonstrably holds no legal jurisdiction. We are currently reviewing land titles, county records, and historical incorporation documents pertaining to the area commonly known as Lakeview Valley. We trust that any individual acting or purporting to act on behalf of such a homeowner association is fully aware of the legal requirements for incorporated associations and the potential liabilities associated with misrepresentation of authority or the preventable collection of fees under false pretenses. We anticipate a swift clarification of these matters. I signed it simply, a concerned property owner. This letter was designed to do a few things. Firstly, to introduce a seed of doubt, a flicker of unease, without revealing my full hand or identity as the cabin owner she was targeting. Secondly, to put her on notice that someone, somewhere, was scrutinizing her activities from a legal perspective. Thirdly, and perhaps most deliciously, to see how she would react. Would she pause, would she investigate the source, or would her arrogance lead her to dismiss it as an idle threat? As expected, her reaction, relayed to me indirectly through the general store owner who had heard it from one of Carol's less enthusiastic neighbors, was one of indignant dismissal. She had apparently scoffed at the anonymous busybody, declaring it was probably that cabin fellow trying to stir up trouble because he does not want to follow the rules. She had proclaimed that her homeowner association was perfectly legitimate, and had been for years, and that some people just cannot stand to see a community well maintained. This confirmed she was doubling down, not backing down. There was no minor confrontation, no direct setback to my plan, because she did not even connect the letter to me personally, attributing it instead to some vague, cowardly troublemaker. Her ego would not allow her to imagine that the target of her scorn could be capable of such a detached, strategic maneuver. The letter served its purpose perfectly. It heightened her sense of being under attack by amorphous rule breakers, further solidifying her self-image as the righteous defender, and ensuring she would be even more strident and performative at her upcoming meeting. She was, in effect, polishing the pedestal from which she was about to fall. The days leading up to the homeowner association meeting, or rather Carol Peterson's self-aggrandizing public forum, were filled with a quiet sense of anticipation on my part. I imagined she was busy preparing her talking points, perhaps practicing her stern admonishments for the unruly cabin owner. I, on the other hand, was calmly organizing my dossier, ensuring every document was pristine, every fact triple-checked. I decided to wear something understated but professional, a pressed shirt, smart trousers, not a suit, that would be too aggressive, but enough to convey seriousness and a departure from the rustic cabin dweller persona she had likely painted for me. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock in the small, rarely used community hall at the edge of the village, a few miles from Lakeview Valley. Carol had booked it, no doubt envisioning a captive audience for her pronouncements. I arrived deliberately 10 minutes late, allowing her to get fully into her stride. As I entered, I saw Carol at a small table at the front, a makeshift lectern before her. There were perhaps 7 or 8 other people in attendance, mostly older residents from the handful of houses in her cul-de-sac. They looked a mixture of bored, obligated, and mildly curious. Carol was in mid-flow, her voice resonating with a tone of grave importance. And it is precisely this disregard for established community standards that threatens the very fabric of Lakeview Estates, she was saying, gesturing emphatically. We have rules, carefully considered rules, for the benefit of all residents, to protect our property values and ensure a harmonious living environment. She paused for dramatic effect, then her eyes landed on me as I quietly took a seat at the back. A small, triumphant smile played on her lips. "Ah, Mr. Ainsworth, so good of you to finally join us. We were just discussing the importance of adherence to the Lakeview Estates Homeowner Association bylaws, specifically concerning unapproved structures and landscaping such as your cabin." Some of the attendees turned to look at me, their expressions neutral. The air was thick with Carol's smug expectation. She clearly anticipated either a contrite apology or a defensive argument from me, either of which would allow her to further assert her authority. I remained silent, my expression calm, allowing her to continue. She spent another 5 minutes outlining the violations at my cabin, the fines I had incurred, and the generous opportunity the homeowner association was giving me to rectify the situation before further action is taken. The suspense was palpable, but it was entirely of her own making. She was winding herself up, building her case against me in front of her small audience, completely oblivious to the fact that she was perfectly setting the stage for my methodical response. The trap was set. The bait taken. All that remained was to spring it. Carol Peterson concluded her monologue with a flourish. "So, Mr. Ainsworth," she said, her voice laced with condescending authority, "the Lakeview Estates Homeowners Association expects your full compliance. The fines are due, and we will require a submitted plan for remediation of the cited violations within 7 days. Do you have anything to say?" This was my cue. I rose slowly, holding a slim leather portfolio. "Actually, Mrs. Peterson," I began, my voice calm and measured, "I do have a few things to say and some information to share that I believe everyone here will find illuminating." I walked to the front of the room, not to her table, but to a small clear space beside it. "My name is Arthur Ainsworth, and yes, I am the owner of the cabin by the lake." I paused, letting that sink in. "What you may not know, Mrs. Peterson, and what I am quite certain the Lakeview Estates Board as you conceive it is unaware of, is that I am also the sole owner of Lakeview Valley Properties Limited Liability Company." I opened the portfolio and took out the first large format document, a detailed surveyor's map of the entire valley. "This limited liability company," I continued, pointing to the vast expanse colored in on the map, "owns all of this land. That includes the lake, the surrounding forests, the access roads, and incidentally the very small parcel of land upon which your cul-de-sac, historically known as the Old Miller Homestead, is situated." A ripple of murmurs went through the small audience. Carol's smile faltered, replaced by a look of confusion, then dawning irritation. "That is preposterous," she sputtered. "Lakeview Estates has been here for decades." "Indeed," I agreed smoothly, "a development called Lakeview Estates was platted, and an entity called the Lakeview Estates Development Corporation was formed. However, I produced my next document with a quiet flourish. According to the official records from the Secretary of State, the Lakeview Estates Development Corporation was formally dissolved on the 12th of March, 1998, for failure to file and pay requisite fees. I held up the dissolution certificate. "There is no legally incorporated, active entity known as the Lakeview Estates Homeowners Association, Mrs. Peterson." Her face began to turn a blotchy red. "The covenants, there are covenants," she insisted, her voice rising. "Yes, there are," I concurred, pulling out another document, "original restrictive covenants attached to the deeds of the lots in your specific, very limited subdivision. I have a copy here. They pertain to minimum building standards and land use within those lots." They make no mention of an ongoing, fee-collecting homeowners association with authority over anything beyond those original plat lines, and certainly no authority whatsoever over the other 500 acres of the valley, which my company owns outright. I then laid out copies of her violation notices and demands for fines next to these documents. Therefore, these notices of violation, these demands for fines, and these threats of liens are, to put it charitably, baseless. They are issued by a non-existent legal entity, claiming authority it does not possess, over property it has no claim to. The room was silent, save for Carol's increasingly ragged breathing. The tables had not just turned, they had been completely upended, revealing the flimsy, rotten supports underneath her entire edifice of power. The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy. Carol Peterson's face had cycled through a remarkable spectrum of colors, finally settling on a waxy, pale hue, except for the angry red splotches on her neck. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, like a fish gasping for air, but no sound emerged. The other attendees were staring, not at me, but at her, their expressions ranging from stunned disbelief to dawning comprehension, and in one or two cases, a hint of poorly concealed amusement. This is an outrage, she finally managed to choke out, her voice trembling with a mixture of fury and panic. You cannot just come in here and lie. The Homeowners Association is real. I am the president. Mrs. Peterson, I said, my tone still infuriatingly calm and factual, I have not presented a single lie. Everything I have stated is a matter of public record. I offered her the file I had prepared, certified copies of all the relevant documents, my company's ownership deeds for the entire valley, the dissolution certificate for the old development corporation, the county plat maps, the original limited covenants. Please feel free to examine them, or better yet, have your attorney examine them. The mention of an attorney seemed to deflate her further. The bluster was rapidly draining away, leaving behind a flustered, exposed woman whose entire platform had just been demolished. The fines, she stammered, looking at the letters I had laid out. The notices are null and void, I stated firmly, issued without legal authority. In fact, attempting to collect money under the guise of a legitimate association that is, in fact, defunct or fictitious, could potentially be construed as fraud, Mrs. Peterson, especially if any dues or fines have actually been collected and deposited into an account not belonging to a legally registered nonprofit corporation. At this, one of the other attendees, an elderly gentleman who had been quiet until now, spoke up. Carol, you told us those dues were for road maintenance on our street. We paid them. Carol shot him a venomous glare, but said nothing. Her carefully constructed world was crumbling around her, piece by piece, exposed by the very person she had sought to publicly humiliate. Her power, built on illusion and intimidation, had vanished with the presentation of undeniable facts. The shock on her face was profound, quickly followed by a wave of impotent rage that left her speechless. Her reign, however petty and localized, was over. The downfall was swift and absolute. There was no argument she could offer, no defense against the clear, documented truth. She had flown too close to the sun on wings of her own arrogance, and now she was crashing back to earth with a very public thud. The Homeowner Association Karen had been dethroned, not by shouting or anger, but by the quiet, relentless application of research and fact. The aftermath of that meeting was as decisive as it was satisfying. Carol Peterson did not say another word. She simply stared at the documents I had laid out, her face a mask of stunned disbelief. The other attendees began to murmur amongst themselves, and a couple of them actually approached the table to look at the papers. The spell was broken. Her authority, which had always been an illusion, had evaporated under the harsh light of truth. She gathered her few personal items from the table, her hands shaking, and practically fled the community hall without a backward glance. My victory was not loud or boisterous. It was the quiet click of a well-sprung trap, the satisfying thud of justice served cold. In the following weeks, the ripples spread. The gentleman who had questioned the road maintenance dues, along with a couple of others from her cul-de-sac, initiated inquiries into the homeowner association funds Carol had been collecting. It turned out she had been depositing them into her personal checking account. While the amounts were not vast, the principle of the matter and the clear misrepresentation led to some very uncomfortable conversations for her with local authorities. No criminal charges were ultimately pressed, as the amounts were relatively small, and she quickly agreed to repay everything. But her reputation in their small enclave was irrevocably shattered. The Lakeview Estates Homeowner Association signs vanished overnight. My peace and quiet at the cabin were restored more profoundly than before. The air itself seemed clearer, free from the oppressive weight of her petty tyranny. The broader impact was subtle but significant. Word got around the wider rural community about the homeowner association queen who was not. It served as a quiet reminder that due diligence is important and that self-proclaimed authority figures often have the flimsiest foundations. For myself, the experience reinforced a lesson I had learned many times in my professional life: bullies thrive on scaring others and lack of knowledge. When confronted with calm, well-prepared facts, their loud talk often falls apart like a popped balloon. There was a deep happiness in having used my skills not for money investigations but for personal fairness, for the return of peace. The funny twist was not lost on me. Carol had tried to control a tiny patch of imagined land, completely unaware of the fact that her target owned the entire area. My thought on the whole thing was that sometimes the greatest power lies not in loud shows, but in quiet knowledge and smart waiting. The lesson of this story: do not think the quiet ones are weak or not smart. Do your homework before you try to force rules that do not exist. And never ever look down on the person who just wants to be left alone in their cabin, because sometimes they own the whole valley. Have you ever seen a bully get their deserved payback in a truly amazing way, not through fighting, but through clear and simple truth? I would love to hear your stories in the comments. Remember to arm yourself with knowledge, because facts are the strongest tool against those who build their fake power on sand.